The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under the door of Marcus Webb's harbor master office like a declaration of war. Marcus, a 52-year-old former Coast Guard officer turned marina owner, held the paper with calloused hands that had guided ships through hurricanes and rescued families from capsized boats. His jaw tightened as he read the words, "Cease and desist. Unauthorized commercial operation on HOA property." For 6 months, Patricia Henderson, the self-appointed queen of Pelican Bay's Homeowners Association, had been circling his marina like a shark. 6 months of complaints, threats, and accusations that Marcus was running an illegal operation. She'd reported him to the county, the state, even tried calling the Coast Guard on him. Every agency had laughed her off, but Patricia wasn't laughing anymore. She'd filed papers claiming the marina docks belonged to the HOA, demanding Marcus vacate within 30 days. What Patricia didn't know, what her arrogance had blinded her to, was that Marcus didn't just run the marina. He owned the entire harbor infrastructure, held the master lease from the state, and controlled every square foot of waterfront access in Pelican Bay. But tonight, everything was about to change. Before we dive into how Marcus dismantled Patricia's empire piece by piece, if you love stories where entitled people finally meet someone they absolutely cannot intimidate, smash that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss how this ends. Now, let's see exactly how a Coast Guard veteran reminded an HOA tyrant what real authority looks like. This is a story in 3 parts. The hostile takeover that pushed a decorated veteran too far, the confrontation where decades of maritime law met suburban entitlement, and the resolution where an entire community learned who actually controlled their waterfront paradise. The first part takes you through Marcus's journey from peaceful marina operator to the target of Patricia's obsession. You'll witness the escalating violations as she transformed from annoying neighbor to legitimate threat, filing false reports and manipulating regulations she didn't understand. Feel the weight of watching your life's work attacked, the exhaustion of defending yourself against someone with unlimited time and zero accountability. Experience the moment when Marcus stopped defending and started documenting, when 28 years of Coast Guard training kicked in, and he began building a case that would expose every lie Patricia had told. The violation wasn't just about property, it was about watching someone try to destroy what you'd spent a lifetime building. The second part drops you into the harbor master's office. On the day Patricia arrived with a sheriff's deputy, county inspector, and HOA lawyer believing she'd finally won. You'll feel the electric tension as Marcus let her walk into a room full of maritime officials, state representatives, and attorneys who'd been waiting for this exact moment. Watch Patricia's confidence crack as Marcus revealed documents she'd never imagined existed, proof that turned her accusations into actionable offenses against her. Experience the shift when predator became prey, when the woman who'd terrorized dozens of homeowners finally faced someone who'd been 3 steps ahead the entire time. The third part delivers justice with the weight of a Coast Guard cutter bearing down. Witness Patricia's world unravel as the community she'd controlled for 5 years discovered the truth about her authority, her finances, and her methods. See Marcus's calculated response. Not revenge, but the systematic dismantling of an illegal operation masquerading as governance. Feel the satisfaction as every homeowner Patricia had bullied learned they'd been paying for services that didn't exist, following rules that had no legal basis, funding a personal empire built on intimidation and fraud. And watch a decorated veteran show an entire waterfront community what real leadership looks like. Here's exactly how it happened. Marcus Webb had purchased the Pelican Bay Marina and Harbor Master's office in 2018, paying $2.4 million for what most people saw as a rundown collection of docks and a weathered building with peeling paint. What they didn't see was the master lease Marcus held with the state of Florida, a document that granted him authority over every inch of tidal waterfront in the Pelican Bay coastal zone. The lease, originally granted to his mentor, Captain John Whitmore, in 1987, and transferred to Marcus upon John's retirement, gave Marcus control of all commercial and recreational watercraft access, dock construction, mooring assignments, and waterway safety regulations within a 2-mile radius. The state had entrusted this authority to Marcus for the same reason they'd trusted John. 28 years of Coast Guard service, a spotless record, and the kind of maritime expertise that couldn't be faked or bought. Marcus lived in a modest 2-bedroom cottage on the Marina property, a simple life that suited a man who'd spent most of his career at sea. He woke at dawn, inspected the docks, helped recreational boaters with their launches, coordinated with commercial fishing vessels, and maintained the waterway with the precision of someone who understood that carelessness on the water meant death. His slip renters loved him. His employees respected him. The local fishing community considered him family. Marcus ran the marina the way he'd run his Coast Guard station. Fair, professional, and with absolute integrity. He charged reasonable fees, maintained the infrastructure meticulously, and never forgot that the water belonged to everyone. He was just the steward who kept it safe. Patricia Henderson had moved into Pelican Bay Estates 3 years ago, a gated community of waterfront homes built in 2015 on the northern edge of the bay. She'd immediately positioned herself as HOA president, running unopposed after the previous president quit in frustration. Patricia was 57, recently divorced, and armed with the dangerous combination of unlimited free time and a desperate need to control something after losing control of her marriage. She wore designer athleisure-like armor, drove a white BMW X5, and spoke to service workers like they were subordinates in a corporate hierarchy only she could see. Within 6 months of taking over the HOA, she'd doubled the dues, implemented a Byzantine system of fines for aesthetic violations, and created committees that existed solely to generate paperwork and justify her authority. The first incident happened in early March, barely a month after Patricia took office. Marcus was replacing worn boards on Dock C when Patricia approached, her heels clicking on the weathered planks like warning shots. She informed him that the HOA had voted to regulate marina operating hours because boat engines were disturbing residents during their morning yoga sessions. Marcus had looked up from his work, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and calmly explained that the marina operated under state authority and Coast Guard regulations, not HOA rules. Patricia's face had flushed crimson. She'd leaned in close, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper, and told Marcus that she'd find a way to shut him down if he didn't comply. Marcus had simply returned to his work, assuming she'd eventually realize the marina predated her community by 40 years, and that her authority ended at her property line. He'd been wrong about Patricia's capacity for reality. The second incident arrived in May. Escalating from annoyance to genuine threat, Marcus received a notice from the county zoning office requiring him to appear at a hearing regarding unpermitted commercial expansion. Someone had filed a complaint claiming Marcus had built new docks without proper approvals and was operating an illegal boat rental service. Marcus had spent 2 days gathering 3 decades of permits, state approvals, and Coast Guard certifications, then another day sitting in a county office while a bored bureaucrat reviewed documents that proved every structure had been legally permitted and inspected. The rental service complaint was pure fiction. Marcus didn't rent boats, never had, and the commercial fishing vessels that used his docks were all independently owned. The county investigator had apologized for wasting Marcus's time and mentioned that the complaint came from Patricia Henderson, who'd submitted a 20-page document full of photographs, measurements, and accusations that demonstrated impressive dedication to being completely wrong. Marcus had driven back to the marina feeling something he hadn't felt since his Coast Guard days. The specific exhaustion that comes from dealing with someone who mistakes volume for authority. Patricia wasn't just annoying, she was beginning to weaponize bureaucracy, and Marcus recognized the danger in that. People who filed false reports didn't usually stop until they either got what they wanted or faced consequences that made them stop. Marcus called his attorney, Daniel Rodriguez, a maritime law specialist he'd known for 15 years. Daniel had listened to the situation and offered advice that Marcus had already been considering. Start documenting. The third incident happened in late July, and it shattered any remaining hope for peaceful resolution. Marcus returned from a 3-day fishing trip to find the marina's main gate locked with an industrial chain and padlock. A laminated notice attached that read, "Property condemned, HOA safety violation. No entry by order of Pelican Bay Estates, HOA." His slip renters had been unable to access their boats. His employees couldn't reach the fuel pumps. 6 commercial fishing crews had lost a day of work because they couldn't launch. Marcus had called the non-emergency police line, and an officer had arrived to cut the lock, apologizing and explaining that the HOA had no authority to lock anyone out of privately owned property, but that he couldn't arrest Patricia for it unless Marcus pressed charges. The officer had suggested Marcus get a restraining order, but his tone made it clear he thought this was a civil matter that would ultimately waste everyone's time in court. Marcus had stood on his dock that evening, watching the sun set over water he'd protected for 7 years, and felt something shift inside him. The lock wasn't just harassment, it was sabotage that had cost his tenants and the fishing community real money. Patricia had crossed from annoying to destructive, and she'd done it with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. Marcus thought about the families who depended on the marina for their livelihoods, the recreational boaters who trusted him to keep them safe, the ecosystem he'd spent nearly 3 decades protecting. He thought about 28 years in the Coast Guard, about the discipline that had taught him to stay calm in hurricanes and the strategic thinking that had earned him commendations for complex rescue operations. Patricia thought she was fighting a simple marina owner, an old man she could bully into submission with paperwork and persistence. She had no idea she'd picked a fight with someone who'd built a career on staying calm under pressure and waiting for exactly the right moment to act. Marcus went inside his office, pulled out 3 accordion files stuffed with permits and licenses, and began the methodical work of building a case. He photographed every document. He created a timeline of Patricia's harassment. He reviewed his master lease agreement and discovered something he'd forgotten. A clause that gave him authority to revoke waterfront access, privileges for any entity that interfered with marina operations or threatened public safety on the waterway. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks making phone calls that Patricia would never know about until it was too late. He contacted the state's Division of Marine Resources. He reached out to former Coast Guard colleagues who now worked in maritime law enforcement. He spoke with every homeowner in Pelican Bay Estates who'd contacted him privately to complain about Patricia's overreach, documenting their stories of harassment, illegal fines, and threats. He hired a forensic accountant to review the HOA's publicly available financial records, and he scheduled a meeting with the county sheriff's office to discuss filing formal charges for the gate incident, making it clear he wasn't interested in petty revenge. He wanted a comprehensive investigation into whether the HOA was operating within its legal authority. By mid-August, Marcus had assembled something that looked less like a defense and more like a prosecution. He'd discovered that Patricia had been collecting special assessments for dock repairs on HOA property that didn't actually exist. The HOA owned the homes and the streets, but not a single inch of waterfront. He'd found evidence that she'd been threatening homeowners with fines for boat violations she had no authority to enforce. He'd documented 6 other instances of her filing false reports with county agencies, wasting taxpayer resources on investigations that went nowhere. And he'd identified the moment when her harassment crossed from annoying to potentially criminal. When she'd locked his gate and cost his tenants quantifiable economic damages. Marcus sat in his office on a humid August evening, the air conditioning rattling in the window, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. If Patricia wanted to play games with someone's livelihood, Marcus would show her what real authority looked like. He'd spent his entire career understanding chain of command, respecting jurisdictional authority, and following regulations to the letter. Patricia had spent 5 years pretending she had power she didn't possess, and Marcus was about to teach her the difference between real authority and performative control. On August 23rd, Marcus received the certified letter, the cease and desist, demanding he vacate the marina within 30 days, claiming the HOA owned the docks and he was operating illegally. Marcus read it 3 times, then called Daniel Rodriguez and said 6 words. "It's time. Let's schedule the meeting." Daniel had laughed, a sound of pure anticipation, and promised to have everything ready within a week. Marcus hung up and looked out at the marina, at the boats rocking gently in their slips, at the water reflecting the evening sun. Patricia thought she'd cornered him. She'd actually just walked into a trap that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Everything was finally ready. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Patricia's cease and desist letter arrived. She'd demanded the meeting herself, calling Daniel Rodriguez directly to insist that Marcus's attorney be present when she took possession of the illegally operated marina. Daniel had agreed immediately, his voice professionally neutral, giving no indication that he'd been coordinating with the state attorney general's office, the county sheriff, and 3 different maritime regulatory agencies. Patricia heard compliance. Marcus heard the sound of a trap snapping shut. Marcus arrived at his harbor master office at 8:30, 2 hours early, and began the careful work of transforming the space into exactly what it was, a government office with full regulatory authority. He'd cleaned for days, organizing decades of permits, licenses, and official correspondence into clear plastic sleeves mounted on the walls. His Coast Guard commendations hung beside his harbor master certification. His master lease from the state of Florida, all 47 pages of legal language establishing his jurisdiction, sat in a leather binder on the conference table. 3 maritime attorneys sat in chairs along the back wall, representing the state's Division of Marine Resources, the County Waterway Authority, and Marcus personally. 2 representatives from the state attorney general's office occupied the far corner, reviewing documents with quiet intensity, and Sheriff Deputy James Morrison, who'd been investigating HOA fraud cases in 3 counties, stood near the door with a folder that had grown considerably thicker over the past week. At 9:45, Patricia's white BMW pulled into the marina parking lot, followed by a county inspector's vehicle and a sedan carrying her HOA attorney, Frederick Paulson. Patricia emerged wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly slip fees, her confidence radiating like heat off asphalt. She'd brought witnesses, 2 HOA board members who looked distinctly uncomfortable, and the county inspector she'd somehow convinced to attend what she believed would be a property seizure. Marcus watched from his office window as she gathered her team, distributing copies of her cease and desist letter like battle plans. She gestured toward the marina with sweeping ownership, her mouth moving rapidly, undoubtedly explaining how she'd finally defeated the stubborn old man who refused to acknowledge her authority. Patricia entered the harbor master office at exactly 10 o'clock. and Marcus watched her confidence crack for the first time. She'd expected a run-down office with a defeated man signing surrender documents. Instead, she walked into a room full of people in suits, official state seals on documents, and an atmosphere of legal formality that suggested she'd drastically misunderstood the situation. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on Marcus, who sat calmly at the head of the conference table in his harbor master uniform, a detail he rarely wore, but that carried the weight of federal maritime authority. Patricia recovered quickly, her face arranging itself into an expression of righteous determination. "Mr. Webb," she began, her voice artificially sweet, "I'm glad you finally agreed to discuss the transition of Marina operations to proper HOA oversight. As outlined in my letter, Mrs. Henderson," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd commanded Coast Guard crews through Category 4 hurricanes. "Please have a seat. I'd like to introduce you to some people before we begin." Patricia's smile tightened, but she sat, flanked by her attorney and the uncomfortable-looking county inspector. Marcus let the silence extend for 3 long seconds, a technique he'd learned in command. Let people sit with their uncertainty before you speak. Then he gestured to his left. "This is James Morrison, Sheriff's Deputy with the County Fraud Investigation Unit. These 2 individuals represent the Florida Attorney General's office. The 3 attorneys behind you represent the State Division of Marine Resources." Patricia opened the binder, and Marcus watched the color drain from her face as she scanned the first page. Her attorney leaned over, reading rapidly, his professional composure cracking around the edges. The county inspector actually stood up, realizing he'd been manipulated into attending what was clearly not a property seizure, but rather something far more serious. Marcus let them read for 30 seconds before continuing. Patricia Henderson, age 57, residing at 847 Pelican Bay Estates Drive. Former corporate executive, divorced, current president of Pelican Bay Estates Homeowners Association. Mother's name Margaret Henderson. Father deceased. 1 sister in Atlanta. You drive a white BMW X5. Lease number... Marcus rattled off the last 6 digits of her VIN, watching her eyes widen. "And you've filed 17 complaints with various county agencies over the past 6 months. Every single one proven false upon investigation." Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her attorney found his voice first. "How did you— This is highly inappropriate." "Mr. Webb, client privacy is not applicable when your client has been filing false reports, threatening local businesses, and attempting to seize property she doesn't own," Daniel Rodriguez cut in smoothly. "Mr. Webb holds a harbor master commission. That position grants him investigative authority regarding waterway safety threats. Mrs. Henderson's pattern of harassment and false reporting constitutes exactly such a threat." Marcus leaned forward, his hands folded on the table, his eyes never leaving Patricia's face. "You locked my gate on July 28th. That action prevented 6 commercial fishing crews from launching, costing them approximately $4,200 in lost income. You filed a false zoning complaint in May, wasting 36 hours of county resources investigating permits you knew were valid. I know you knew because you were copied on the approval documents when I renewed them in January. And for the past 8 months, you've been collecting special assessments from homeowners in your community for dock maintenance on HOA property that, according to county records and state surveys, doesn't exist." The room went completely silent. Patricia's face cycled through shock, fear, and finally settled on defensive anger. "That's absurd. The HOA owns the waterfront adjacent to our properties. We have rights." "You have riparian rights," Marcus corrected, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now, "which grant homeowners reasonable access to navigable water for private use. What you don't have is ownership of the tidal zone, the docks, or any commercial waterway infrastructure. What you definitely don't have is the authority to collect money for maintaining property you don't own. Deputy Morrison stepped forward, placing a folder on the table. Mrs. Henderson, we've been investigating financial irregularities in HOA management across 3 counties. Your organization appeared on our radar 6 weeks ago, when we received complaints from 17 homeowners regarding unauthorized fees. Mr. Webb's documentation accelerated our investigation considerably. Patricia's attorney was speed reading through the master lease now, his face growing increasingly pale. Patricia, we need to discuss this privately. Right now. No, Patricia snapped, her composure finally shattering completely. This is ridiculous. I have every right to regulate what happens in my community. The Marina is a blight. It's noisy. It's been here since 1979, Marcus said quietly, pulling out a framed photograph that showed the Marina in its early days, before Pelican Bay Estates existed. Your community was built in 2015, on land that was specifically zoned residential with the explicit understanding that the Marina predated it and would continue operations. You moved next to an established marine facility and then spent 5 years trying to shut it down through harassment and fraudulent claims. Marcus stood, walking to the wall where his permits hung. He pulled down a specific document, dated 3 months ago, and placed it in front of Patricia. This is a formal complaint I filed with the State Division of Marine Resources regarding persistent interference with marina operations. It includes documentation of every false report you filed, every threat you made, and every instance where you attempted to usurp authority you don't possess. He pulled down another document. This is a civil complaint for economic damages, filed on behalf of the commercial fishing operators who lost income due to your gate stunt. The amount is $4,200 plus legal fees. He pulled down a third document, and his voice grew colder. And this is a request for revocation of waterfront access privileges, filed under the authority granted to me as harbor master. Based on your pattern of threatening public safety through interference with marine operations, I'm formally recommending that every homeowner in Pelican Bay Estates lose their dock, and launching privileges until the HOA demonstrates compliance with maritime safety regulations and proves it's operating within its legal authority. The room erupted. Patricia's attorney was yelling about overreach. The HOA board members were protesting that they had nothing to do with Patricia's actions. The county inspector was backing toward the door, clearly wanting no part of what was unfolding. Patricia herself sat frozen, finally understanding that she wasn't in a negotiation. She was watching her empire collapse in real time. Marcus held up one hand, and the room went silent. 28 years of commanding respect through presence rather than volume served him well. You have a choice, Patricia. Option 1, I proceed with every legal action I've outlined. The state investigates the HOA finances. The commercial fishing operators sue for damages. Every homeowner in your community loses water access while the investigation proceeds, and they all learn exactly why. Your name becomes synonymous with fraud and harassment. You spend the next 2 years in court, and probably the 2 years after that dealing with lawsuits from your own homeowners. He paused, letting that sink in. Option 2, you resign as HOA president immediately. You refund every penny collected for fictional dock maintenance. The forensic accountant has calculated that at approximately $68,000 over 3 years. You issue a written apology to me, to the commercial fishing operators, and to every homeowner you've harassed with illegal fines. You sign a legally binding agreement never to hold any position of authority in any HOA again. And you stay far, far away from my marina. Patricia's hands were shaking. Her attorney looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Deputy Morrison added quietly, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Henderson, option 2 keeps this civil. Option 1 likely involves criminal charges for fraud and filing false reports. Mr. Webb is being generous." Marcus sat back down, his eyes never leaving Patricia's face. You thought you could bully a simple marina owner. What you actually did was harass a harbor master with full state authority, documented every threatening action you took, and gave me 6 months of evidence that proves you've been operating a fraudulent scheme. I didn't want this fight, Patricia. I wanted to run my marina in peace, but you kept pushing, kept threatening, kept trying to destroy what I've spent my life building. So now you get to choose, walk away now, or have your entire world investigated by people who actually have the authority you've been pretending to possess. Patricia Henderson looked at the documents spread across the table, at the officials watching her, at the evidence of her own arrogance carefully catalogued and ready for prosecution. Her shoulders sagged. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. What do I need to sign? Marcus slid a document across the table. Everything I outlined. Daniel will witness it. And Patricia? He waited until she looked up, meeting his eyes. If you ever come near my marina again, if you ever file another false report, if you ever threaten anyone in this community with your imaginary authority, I won't offer you a choice. I'll bury you in paperwork so deep that you'll need GPS to find your way out. Do we understand each other? Patricia nodded, her hand reaching for a pen with visible reluctance. Her attorney tried one last protest, but Patricia waved him off, signing document after document with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. The HOA board members quietly indicated they'd support an emergency vote to accept her resignation. The county inspector fled the moment Patricia signed the agreement, promising not to file false reports. And Deputy Morrison collected copies of everything, mentioning that the fraud investigation would continue regardless of Patricia's agreement. The other counties deserved their justice too. Marcus watched Patricia leave his office 30 minutes later. Her cream pantsuit wrinkled, her confidence completely shattered, her BMW pulling out of the parking lot like a retreat from a battlefield. He stood at his window watching the water and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 28 years in the Coast Guard had taught him that real authority came from competence, not volume. Patricia had confused the two, and that confusion had cost her everything. Daniel Rodriguez clapped Marcus on the shoulder. That was beautiful, Marcus. Surgical. Marcus turned from the window, his face settling back into its usual calm expression. She left me no choice. You don't threaten people's livelihoods because you're bored and need control. The fishing crews needed justice. The homeowners needed protection. And Patricia needed to learn that authority without legitimacy is just bullying with paperwork. The room cleared slowly, officials and attorneys filing out with promises to stay in touch if Patricia violated the agreement. Marcus was left alone in his harbor master office, surrounded by the documentation of a career spent serving and protecting, and he smiled for the first time in 6 months. The emergency HOA meeting happened 3 days later, on a Friday evening in the Pelican Bay Estates Community Center. Marcus didn't attend. He'd made his point and had no interest in watching Patricia's public humiliation. But Daniel Rodriguez went on his behalf, armed with copies of every document and prepared to answer any questions from homeowners who'd been living under Patricia's fraudulent regime. Marcus received the full report by phone at 7:30 that evening. Sitting on his dock with a beer and watching the sunset paint the water gold and crimson. Patricia had resigned at the meeting's opening, her statement brief and carefully worded to avoid admitting criminal wrongdoing while still acknowledging she'd exceeded her authority in certain matters. The homeowners, Daniel reported, had received the news with reactions ranging from quiet satisfaction to outright celebration. 17 different people had stood up to share their own stories of Patricia's harassment, illegal fines for aesthetic violations that weren't in the bylaws, threats to sue homeowners who questioned her decisions, special assessments for projects that never materialized, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear that had turned the community from a pleasant neighborhood into something resembling a dictatorship with palm trees. The dock maintenance revelation had hit especially hard. Patricia had collected $68,000 over 3 years for maintaining waterfront infrastructure that the HOA didn't own, couldn't access, and had no legal responsibility for. Several homeowners had questioned the assessments at the time, and Patricia had shut them down with threats of liens and legal action. The forensic accountant's report, presented by Daniel, showed that the money had gone into a general HOA fund that Patricia controlled with minimal oversight, used for everything from her own legal fees to landscaping upgrades on common areas that primarily benefited properties near her own home. It wasn't quite embezzlement. The money had stayed within the HOA, but it was close enough to fraud that the new interim board voted immediately to demand full repayment. The waterfront access issue had required more explanation, but Daniel had brought charts, maps, and copies of Marcus's master lease to make it clear. The homeowners didn't lose their riparian rights. They could still access the water from their properties, but they'd never had the authority to regulate marina operations, control dock usage, or collect fees related to waterfront maintenance. Their HOA governed their homes and common areas, full stop. The water belonged to the state, and Marcus held the lease that governed commercial and recreational use within the coastal zone. Several homeowners had actually apologized to Daniel for Patricia's behavior, expressing embarrassment that their elected representative had spent months harassing a man who'd been protecting their waterway access for 7 years. The vote to accept. Patricia's resignation passed unanimously. The vote to demand repayment of the fraudulent dock fees passed with 2 abstentions. Board members who'd been too intimidated by Patricia to oppose her and were now terrified of their own liability. And the vote to send Marcus a formal community apology passed with spontaneous applause. Daniel reported that at least a dozen homeowners had asked for Marcus's contact information, wanting to thank him personally and inquire about marina services for their own boats. Patricia had spent years convincing them the marina was a threat. Now they were discovering it was an asset they'd been prevented from enjoying. Marcus finished his beer and called it a night, satisfied that justice had been served without requiring him to be vindictive. He'd protected his livelihood, defended the fishing community, and freed an entire neighborhood from a tyrant's control. That was enough. The complications arrived 2 weeks later, though Marcus had been expecting them. Patricia's attorney filed a motion contesting the resignation agreement, claiming Marcus had coerced his client through threats and intimidation. The motion was poorly written, desperately grasping at procedural technicalities, and it died in preliminary hearings when 3 different officials testified that Patricia had signed the documents voluntarily after being presented with evidence of her own misconduct. The judge had actually laughed audibly when Patricia's attorney suggested that a harbor master with full state authority had somehow acted inappropriately by documenting harassment and filing formal complaints. The motion was denied. Patricia was ordered to pay Marcus's legal fees for the frivolous filing, and her attorney quietly withdrew from the case. The real consequence came when Deputy Morrison's investigation expanded beyond Pelican Bay. Patricia's pattern of fraudulent fees and unauthorized authority turned out to be part of a broader trend she'd served on 2 previous HOA boards before moving to Pelican Bay, and both communities reported similar issues once investigators started asking questions. Special assessments for projects that didn't happen, threats against homeowners who questioned expenses, a consistent pattern of using HOA authority to settle personal grudges and control community members through fear. The fraud investigation grew from a local matter into a multi-county case that attracted attention from the state attorney general's office. Marcus learned about Patricia's expanding legal troubles through Daniel Rodriguez, who'd maintained contact with the investigators. Patricia had hired a criminal defense attorney. She'd put her house up for sale, and she'd apparently told neighbors she was being persecuted by a vindictive marina owner with government connections, a narrative that fell apart the moment anyone reviewed the actual evidence. Marcus felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a grim acknowledgement that people like Patricia rarely stopped until they were forced to face consequences. She'd spent years wielding fake authority to hurt people, and now she was learning that real authority came with real accountability. The best outcome came in September, 6 weeks after Patricia's resignation. The Pelican Bay Estates HOA elected a new president, Rebecca Santos, a retired teacher who'd lived in the community since it opened and who'd been one of Patricia's most vocal critics. Rebecca scheduled a meeting with Marcus within days of taking office, arriving at the Marina office with homemade banana bread and a genuine smile. She apologized on behalf of the community, thanked Marcus for not taking his anger out on innocent homeowners, and asked if there was any way the HOA could support the marina's operations going forward. Marcus had been prepared for lingering hostility or awkward tension. Instead, he found himself sitting on his dock with a competent leader who actually understood the difference between authority and service. They discussed ways the HOA could promote marina access for residents, potentially negotiate group rates for slip rentals, and coordinate on waterway cleanup events that would benefit the entire bay. Rebecca mentioned that several homeowners had expressed interest in taking boating safety courses, and Marcus offered to host them at the marina free of charge. By the end of their conversation, Marcus had gone from defending his operation against attack to partnering with the community next door. Exactly the relationship he'd wanted from the beginning. 3 months later, on a cool November morning, Marcus stood on his dock watching Rebecca and 15 Pelican Bay residents launching kayaks for a community waterway cleanup. The HOA had provided equipment and volunteers. Marcus had provided the launching area, safety briefing, and coordination with the county environmental services. Kids splashed in the shallows while parents filled trash bags with debris. Couples paddled out into the bay, enjoying the kind of peaceful recreation that had always been available, but that Patricia's vendetta had made impossible to embrace. Marcus watched it all with quiet satisfaction, thinking about how a community transformed once fear was replaced with actual leadership. Rebecca approached as the cleanup was ending, her kayak secured and her life vest dripping bay water. "You know what's funny?" she said, accepting the towel Marcus offered. "Half these people were terrified of you 6 months ago. Patricia had convinced them you were running some kind of illegal operation, that the marina was dangerous, that you'd sue anyone who came near it. Now they're asking when you're hosting the next safety course." Marcus smiled, watching a father teaching his daughter to tie a cleat hitch on one of his dock cleats. Patricia needed an enemy. Made her feel powerful. Easier to control people when they think there's a threat outside their gates. Well, she's gone now. Moved to Tennessee, I heard. Probably shopping for a new HOA to terrorize. Rebecca paused. "The criminal investigation is still ongoing, though. My cousin works in the county clerk's office. Said they've found evidence of similar schemes in 3 different communities. Patricia's going to be dealing with this for years." Marcus felt no triumph in that news, just a weary acknowledgement that some people spent their entire lives mistaking control for power, never realizing that real authority came from competence and service. He'd spent 28 years earning respect through expertise and integrity. Patricia had spent 5 years demanding respect through threats and intimidation. Only one of those approaches could sustain itself long-term, and Patricia was learning that lesson the hard way. The kayakers finished loading their boats and trash bags, calling out thanks to Marcus as they headed back to their cars. Rebecca lingered, watching the water settle back into calm. "Serious question, Marcus. How did you stay so calm? When Patricia was at her worst, threatening your business, Locking your gates, how did you not just lose it? Marcus considered the question, thinking about hurricane-force winds and capsizing boats, and the cold calculation required to execute rescue operations when seconds mattered. Coast Guard taught me that panic is expensive. When you're dealing with someone who wants a reaction, the worst thing you can do is give them one. Patricia thrived on drama. Every time someone fought back emotionally, she won. So I documented everything, built my case, and waited for her to overstep badly enough that I could respond with facts instead of anger. She wanted a fight. I gave her evidence. Rebecca nodded slowly, understanding settling in her expression. That's why she collapsed so completely. She'd built her entire approach around intimidation, and you just wouldn't be intimidated. Exactly. People like Patricia count on their targets being too scared or too tired to fight back properly. But I'd spent 3 decades dealing with actual threats. Natural disasters, life-or-death situations, real emergencies. A bored woman with fake authority throwing tantrums? Marcus shrugged. That wasn't a threat. That was an administrative problem that needed solving. Rebecca laughed, genuine and warm. I wish more people understood that. Half the reason Patricia got away with it for so long was because everyone treated her like she was actually powerful instead of just loud. She checked her watch, then extended her hand. Thanks for this, Marcus. For the cleanup space, for not holding grudges, for showing our community what good leadership looks like. Next month, we're doing a beach restoration project. I hope you'll join us. Marcus shook her hand, feeling the genuine respect in her grip. I'll be there. And Rebecca, thank you for actually caring about your community instead of just controlling it. That's the difference. She smiled and headed up the dock, joining the dispersing volunteers. Marcus watched them go, then turned back to his marina. The docks were sturdy, the boat secure, the water calm. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been before Patricia's campaign began, except now the community next door saw him as an ally instead of an enemy. He'd lost 6 months of peace dealing with her harassment, but he'd gained something more valuable. Proof that competence and patience could dismantle even the most determined tyrant. Marcus walked to his office, intending to finish paperwork but paused at his wall of certifications and permits. His eyes landed on a framed photograph he'd nearly forgotten about. Captain John Whitmore standing on these same docks in 1987, the day he'd first received the Harbor Master Commission. John had taught Marcus everything about running a marina. The technical skills, the regulatory knowledge, the maritime law. But the most important lesson had come on Marcus's final day of training, when John had explained what the Harbor Master title really meant. You're not just managing docks and boats, John had said, his weathered face serious. You're protecting something bigger, the community's relationship with the water. Some people will respect that. Others will see it as an obstacle to whatever petty agenda they're pushing. When that happens, you don't get emotional. You remember that this commission came from the state, that your authority is real and earned, and that your job is to protect the waterway and everyone who depends on it. You stay professional, you follow procedure, and you never, ever let someone's ignorance of the law become your emergency. Marcus had carried that lesson through 7 years of marina operations, but he'd never truly understood its depth until Patricia forced him to defend his authority against someone who fundamentally didn't understand what authority meant. She'd thought power came from yelling, from threatening, from manufacturing crises that required her intervention. Marcus had shown her that real power came from documentation, from legitimate jurisdiction, from the patient accumulation of evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny. Patricia had fought with emotions. Marcus had responded with facts. And facts, backed by legitimate authority, were undefeated. His phone buzzed. A text from Daniel Rodriguez. Judge ruled on Patricia's final motion. Case dismissed with prejudice. She's been ordered to pay another $4,200 in legal fees. Also, county issued formal findings that HOA operated outside its authority. 17 homeowners filing suit against her personally. Thought you'd want to know. Marcus read the message twice, then set his phone down. He'd told Rebecca he felt no triumph in Patricia's downfall, and that remained true. But he'd be lying if he claimed he felt nothing. What he felt was vindication, not for himself, but for every person Patricia had bullied over 5 years. The fishing crews who'd lost income, the homeowners she'd fined for violations she'd invented, the community members she'd silenced with threats. They were all getting their justice now, and Patricia was learning that fake authority couldn't protect her from real consequences. The afternoon sun slanted through his office windows, warming the room with golden light. Marcus pulled out a folder labeled Future Projects and began reviewing his plans for dock expansion. Plans he'd shelved during Patricia's harassment because he couldn't risk giving her more ammunition. Now, with her gone and the community supportive, he could move forward. 3 new commercial slips for the fishing fleet. A small boat rental service for tourists, the irony of finally implementing the service Patricia had falsely accused him of operating wasn't lost on him. And a covered pavilion for community events, something Rebecca had specifically requested during their meeting. Marcus drafted an email to the State Division of Marine Resources requesting preliminary approval for the expansion. He included updated environmental impact assessments, structural engineering reports, and letters of support from the Commercial Fishing Association. The application was thorough, professional, and exactly the kind of meticulously documented proposal that legitimate authority required. He hit send and leaned back in his chair, satisfied that he was building something sustainable instead of just defending against destruction. That evening, Marcus locked his office and walked down to his usual spot at the end of Dock A, where he kept a weathered bench that Captain John had built 40 years ago. The sun was setting over Pelican Bay, painting the water in shades of amber and rose. A pelican, the bay's namesake, circled overhead before diving smoothly into the shallows, emerging seconds later with a fish struggling in its pouch. Marcus watched the bird settle on a piling to enjoy its catch, and he thought about cycles of predator and prey, about the natural order that governed everything from ecosystems to human behavior. Patricia had been a predator, feeding on fear and confusion, thriving in an environment where people didn't understand their rights or the limits of her authority. But predators could only hunt in darkness, in spaces where information was scarce and victims were isolated. Marcus had turned on the lights, literally exposing her schemes through documentation and investigation, and once the truth was visible, Patricia's predatory advantages evaporated. She'd become what she'd always actually been, just another person with opinions, stripped of the fake authority she'd wielded like a weapon. A boat motor hummed in the distance, the Santos family heading out for an evening fishing trip, their voices carrying across the water in excited conversation. Marcus recognized Rebecca's laugh, warm and genuine, so different from Patricia's performative cheerfulness that had always carried an edge of threat. The Santoses waved as they passed Marcus's dock, and he waved back, feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Simple contentment with his work and his place in this waterfront community. His phone rang. Unknown number. Marcus almost declined, but years of Coast Guard training had taught him that important calls often came from numbers he didn't recognize. He answered, "Mr. Webb, this is County Supervisor Linda Martinez. I'm calling because we've been reviewing the handling of complaints filed against your Marina operation, and frankly, I'm appalled at how much county resources were wasted investigating frivolous claims. I want to formally apologize on behalf of the county and assure you that we're implementing new screening procedures to prevent this kind of harassment going forward." Marcus listened as Supervisor Martinez explained the new policies. requiring complainants to provide preliminary evidence before investigations launched, implementing penalties for repeatedly filing false reports, and creating a liaison position to help small business owners navigate bureaucratic challenges. It was everything Marcus would have suggested if asked. Practical reforms born from his specific experience, but designed to protect countless others who might face similar harassment. Additionally, Martinez continued, "We're creating a county waterfront advisory board, and I'd like to invite you to serve on it. Your expertise and your professional handling of this entire situation demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership we need in that role. Would you be interested?" Marcus looked out at the marina, at the docks he maintained and the water he protected, and made a decision that Captain John would have approved of. "I'd be honored, Supervisor Martinez. When do we start?" They talked for another 10 minutes, discussing logistics and meeting schedules. When Marcus hung up, he realized he'd just agreed to expand his role from protecting this specific marina to helping shape waterway policy for the entire county. Patricia had tried to diminish his authority. Instead, her harassment had elevated his profile, demonstrated his competence under pressure, and created opportunities he'd never sought but was uniquely qualified to fill. The universe, Marcus reflected, had a sense of irony. 2 months later, on a crisp January morning, Marcus stood before the first meeting of the County Waterfront Advisory Board. 8 members total: marina operators, environmental scientists, commercial fishing representatives, and coastal property owners, all gathered to address the complex challenge of balancing development with conservation, commercial use with residential peace. Marcus had been elected board chair unanimously, a role he accepted with the same calm competence he brought to every responsibility. The meeting room overlooked Pelican Bay, offering a view of Marcus's marina in the distance. As he called the meeting to order, Marcus caught sight of his docks, the boat secured properly, the water reflecting morning sunlight. Everything in its right place. Everything protected and maintained through competence rather than control, through service rather than intimidation. Across the county, in a rental apartment in Tennessee, Patricia Henderson was probably still telling herself she'd been wronged, that she'd been persecuted, that her authority had been legitimate and her actions justified. Marcus didn't waste energy thinking about her delusions. He'd learned long ago that you couldn't change people who refused to see their own faults. You could only protect others from their damage and build systems that prevented similar harm in the future. And that's exactly what Marcus was doing. The advisory board would create guidelines that protected both waterfront access and residential peace. They'd develop policies that respected legitimate authority while preventing the kind of overreach Patricia had attempted. They'd build something sustainable, something that would outlast any individual person's ego or agenda. Marcus had spent his career building things that lasted: rescue protocols, safety systems, marina infrastructure. Now he was building something even more important, a framework that would protect his community long after he retired. As the meeting progressed and board members discussed tidal conservation zones and commercial slip allocations, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. Patricia had tried to destroy him because she needed an enemy to validate her sense of power. Instead, she'd revealed his competence to people who actually had authority. The meeting adjourned at noon, and Marcus drove back to his marina, ready for an afternoon of routine maintenance and slip inspections. As he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed a small sailboat launching from his docks, new renters judging by their careful movements and the way they were double-checking every line. Marcus walked down to offer assistance if needed, and the couple waved enthusiastically. "Mr. Webb, we just moved to Pelican Bay last month. Rebecca Santos told us you're the person to talk to about sailing lessons. Would you have time in your schedule?" Marcus smiled, recognizing the cycle beginning again. New community members, new relationships, new opportunities to serve the waterway and the people who loved it. Absolutely. Let's talk after you get back from your sail. I'll put the coffee on. They thanked him and pushed off from the dock, their sail catching the breeze and pulling them smoothly into the bay. Marcus watched them go, thinking about Captain John, about 28 years in the Coast Guard, about the long chain of service and competence that had brought him to this moment. Patricia had been a storm, destructive, chaotic, demanding his full attention for a season. But storms passed. What remained was the work, the water, the endless task of protecting something bigger than any individual ego. Marcus Webb, 52 years old, harbor master of Pelican Bay and chair of the County Waterfront Advisory Board, walked back to his office with his coffee and his paperwork and his quiet satisfaction. He'd weathered the storm. He'd protected his people. And he'd proven that real authority, earned through competence, exercised with integrity, and backed by legitimate jurisdiction, would always outlast the performative power of entitled bullies who mistook volume for strength. As Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing the day's tasks, his eyes landed on a framed quote Captain John had given him years ago. The mark of a true leader isn't how they command when times are easy. It's how they stay calm when under attack, how they respond to threats with competence rather than emotion, and how they build something lasting from the ashes of someone else's destructive ego. Patricia Henderson had tried to burn down Marcus's Marina, his livelihood, and his reputation. Instead, she'd given him the opportunity to demonstrate everything that quote described. And in the end, Marcus hadn't just survived the attack, he'd built something better from it, transforming a defensive battle into an expansion of his service to the entire waterfront community. Justice, Marcus had learned, wasn't always loud or immediate. Sometimes it was quiet, methodical, and backed by documentation. Sometimes it looked like an exhausted veteran patiently building a case, while an entitled bully exhausted herself with threats. Sometimes it took the form of competence outlasting chaos, of legitimate authority dismantling fake power, one documented violation at a time. And sometimes, justice was simply this: sitting in your office, doing work you loved, protecting water and people you cared about, while the person who tried to destroy you learned the hard way that authority without legitimacy was just noise, and noise, no matter how loud, eventually faded into silence. Marcus opened his task list and began his afternoon work, the sound of water lapping against docks providing a gentle rhythm to his thoughts. The bay was calm. His marina was secure. His community was thriving. And somewhere in Tennessee, Patricia Henderson was learning that you couldn't bully your way to respect. You could only earn it through service, competence, and the kind of patient integrity that outlasted every storm. The sun continued its arc across the sky. The boats rocked gently in their slips. And Marcus Webb, harbor master, protected it all with the quiet competence of someone who'd never needed to prove his authority because his actions spoke louder than any title ever could. Across the country in Sedona, Arizona, retired federal prosecutor Margaret Chen was enjoying her morning coffee on the deck of her desert estate when her HOA president arrived unannounced, demanding she remove the xeriscaping she'd spent 3 months installing and replace it with appropriate grass lawns like everyone else. Margaret set down her coffee with the same deliberate calm she'd once used before, cross-examining hostile witnesses, pulled out the Arizona Water Conservation Ordinance she'd helped draft during her time on the State Environmental Commission, and smiled. "I'm curious," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years prosecuting white-collar fraud. "Exactly how much research did you do before driving to my property to make demands?" "Because I'm looking at your HOA bylaws, and I'm noticing some fascinating financial irregularities that someone with, say, subpoena power might find interesting." The HOA president's face went pale.